The photograph, taken by traveling photographer Samuel Massery in October 1831, 8 weeks after Nat Turner's rebellion ended, shows a scene that should not exist according to the social rules governing interactions between enslaved people and their owners in antebellum Virginia. A young black man, approximately 19 years old, stands at the edge of a plantation house porch, his posture neither servile nor aggressive, but rather protective, positioned so that he can see both the elderly white woman seated in a rocking chair and the approach to the house beyond. The woman, approximately 73 years old based on plantation records, sits with her hands folded in her lap, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who has survived recent trauma. Between them exists a spatial relationship unusual for master-slave interactions, close enough to suggest familiarity, positioned so the young man can interpose himself between the woman and any approaching threat. The photograph captures a moment during Southampton County's recovery from the bloodiest slave rebellion in American history. A rebellion that killed 55 white people and freed or scattered approximately 2,300 enslaved people over 48 hours in August 1831. Before militia suppression killed approximately 120 black people, rebels and innocent victims alike, in retaliation. August 23, 1831, 2:47 a.m. Whitfield Plantation, Southampton County, Virginia. Temperature, 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The pre-dawn darkness broken only by moonlight, filtering through trees and the distant orange glow of fires burning at neighboring plantations 3 miles to the east. Daniel, 19 years old and enslaved property of Margaret Whitfield since age 7, wakes to sounds that don't belong in the normal rhythm of plantation life. Distant shouting, the crack of gunfire, the smell of smoke carrying on wind from the direction of the Turner plantation where Nat Turner's rebellion began 12 hours earlier. Daniel has heard whispers about Turner's planned uprising for weeks. Enslaved people communicate through networks their owners don't understand or can't control. But he dismissed the whispers as fantasy because successful slave rebellion in Virginia seems impossible given the state's militia system and the brutal efficiency with which previous uprisings have been suppressed. But the sounds and smells reaching Daniel's cabin at 2:47 a.m. suggest the impossible is happening. He dresses quickly, leaves his cabin in the slave quarters, and walks 200 feet to the main house where Margaret Whitfield lives, alone except for house servants. Margaret's husband Thomas died 8 years ago in 1823. Their 3 children moved to other states decades earlier. And the plantation's 47 enslaved people represent Margaret's only regular human contact, besides occasional visits from neighbors and family. Daniel, as head house servant responsible for indoor maintenance and personal service to Margaret, has access to the main house that field workers don't. A privileged position that puts him close to information about external events. He enters through the kitchen door at 2:52 a.m. and finds Margaret awake in her sitting room, holding an oil lamp, her face showing the fear that every white Virginian has felt since Nat Turner's rebellion began spreading through Southampton County like fire through dry timber. "Daniel," she says, her voice surprisingly steady despite obvious terror. The other servants have left, all of them. Mary, Susan, Joseph, Thomas. I heard them leaving perhaps an hour ago. I believe something terrible is happening. Daniel nods, confirming what she already knows. It's a rebellion, ma'am. Started at the Turner plantation yesterday. They're moving plantation to plantation, freeing the enslaved people, killing the owners. I expect they'll reach here within hours, maybe less. The conversation that follows over the next 14 minutes will determine both their fates for the coming weeks and complicate every simple narrative about slavery, resistance, and human relationships within oppressive systems. Margaret asks Daniel a question that reveals both her fear and her recognition of their actual relationship beyond the legal master-slave fiction. Will you kill me, Daniel? Or will you leave when the others come? Daniel's answer, as he later recounted to investigators, and as Margaret confirmed in her own testimony, reflects a complexity that historical narratives of slave rebellion often simplify. "I'm not going to kill you, ma'am, and I'm not going to leave you here to be killed by others. I'm staying. We'll protect each other until this is over." This decision, to stay when escape is possible, to protect when rebellion offers justification for violence, requires understanding Daniel's history with Margaret Whitfield and the uncommon nature of their relationship within the context of slavery's brutality. Daniel was born in 1812 on a plantation in North Carolina. Orphaned at age 7 when both his parents died during a yellow fever outbreak in 1819, and sold to Thomas Whitfield that same year for $150, a low price reflecting Daniel's young age and the market glut of orphaned enslaved children following the epidemic. Thomas Whitfield bought Daniel specifically as a house servant for Margaret, who had expressed desire for a child to raise after their own children had grown and left home. This decision, treating an enslaved child as substitute for biological children, was not uncommon among plantation owners who rationalized slavery through paternalistic ideology, claiming enslaved people were childlike dependents requiring white supervision. Margaret treated Daniel with kindness, unusual even by the standards of benevolent slave owners. She taught him to read despite Virginia laws prohibiting slave literacy. She allowed him to eat meals prepared for the family rather than the standard enslaved people's rations. She provided him clothing and sleeping quarters superior to those of field workers. And she spoke to him using language that acknowledged his intelligence and humanity, rather than the degrading terminology most owners employed. These advantages made Daniel's enslavement more comfortable than most enslaved people experienced. But they didn't make him free. He still couldn't leave the plantation without permission, couldn't earn wages for his labor, couldn't marry without owner approval, couldn't protect himself from sale if Margaret decided to sell him, and lived under constant awareness that his relatively privileged position depended entirely on Margaret's continued goodwill. But Daniel's feelings toward Margaret went beyond rational calculation of his comparative advantages within slavery. He loved her, not in the romantic sense that Southern mythology would later imagine to sanitize slavery's horrors, but in the complicated way that children love parental figures, even when those figures participate in systems that oppress them. Margaret had been the only consistent adult presence in Daniel's life since age 7. The person who taught him to read, who spoke to him with kindness, who treated him as though his thoughts and feelings mattered. Daniel understood intellectually that Margaret's kindness didn't erase her complicity in owning him, that her affection didn't change the fundamental injustice of his enslavement. But emotions aren't governed by intellectual understanding. He loved her despite knowing that love existed within a system designed to exploit him. The rebellion reaching Whitfield Plantation at approximately 4:15 a.m. on August 23, 1831, consists of approximately 40 enslaved people armed with axes, knives, and 4 stolen firearms, led by Nat Turner's lieutenants, who spread out from the main group to cover more territory and free more enslaved people. The rebels arrive at the plantation's edge, announce their presence with shouts and gunfire, and call for the 47 enslaved people on Whitfield Plantation to join them or flee to freedom. Within 15 minutes, all 47 enslaved people have left the plantation, some joining the rebellion, others simply escaping during the chaos, all taking advantage of this unprecedented moment when the machinery of slavery has temporarily broken down. All except Daniel, who remains in the main house with Margaret. One of the rebellion's leaders, a man named Samuel, whom Daniel knows from interplantation gatherings, approaches the main house at 4:23 a.m. and calls for Daniel to come out. "Daniel, we're freeing everybody. Kill the mistress or leave her, but you're coming with us." Daniel appears on the porch at 4:25 a.m. positions himself between the door and the approaching rebels, and delivers a response that Samuel will later recount with mixture of confusion and anger. "I'm not coming. I'm staying here. You move on to other plantations, and I'll tell anyone who asks that you never came here." Samuel's response reflects the impossibility of understanding Daniel's choice within the rebellion's framework. You're choosing slavery over freedom? Choosing your mistress over your people? You're a fool or a traitor, probably both. Daniel's answer, spoken loud enough for the approximately 20 rebels gathered in front of the house to hear, "I'm choosing to protect someone who needs protection. You do what you need to do. I'll do what I need to do. Now move on before militia catches up with you here." The standoff lasts approximately 3 minutes. Rebels arguing among themselves about whether to force Daniel to join them, whether to kill Margaret regardless of Daniel's protection, whether to waste time on this situation when they need to keep moving to stay ahead of gathering militia forces. Samuel makes the final decision. "We're leaving. But you're making a mistake you'll regret, Daniel. When this is over, you'll still be enslaved, and we'll be free." The rebels depart at 4:31 a.m., moving toward the next plantation 2 miles south. Daniel returns inside the main house, bars the doors and windows, and begins preparing for what he knows will be a long period of isolation and danger with Margaret. The next 47 days, from August 23 to October 8, 1831, will test Daniel's decision in ways he cannot anticipate in the immediate aftermath of the rebels' departure. Southampton County descends into chaos as Nat Turner's rebellion spreads across an area of approximately 20 square miles, killing 55 white people before militia forces suppress the uprising on August 25th, just 48 hours after it began. But the suppression creates its own violence. Militia and vigilante groups kill approximately 120 black people. Rebel participants, suspected sympathizers, and completely innocent enslaved people caught in the indiscriminate retaliation. The county becomes a war zone where no black person is safe, and where any white person might be killed by rebels who haven't yet heard that the main uprising has been suppressed. Whitfield Plantation sits isolated in this chaos. Its enslaved population fled, its owner elderly and vulnerable. Its only protection, a 19-year-old man who has chosen loyalty over liberation. Daniel's first priority is security. He boards up the ground floor windows using planks torn from the barn. He bars all doors from inside using furniture and timber. He moves all firearms in the house, 2 rifles and a pistol that Thomas Whitfield kept for hunting and self-defense, to the main room where he and Margaret will live for the duration of their isolation. He then begins rationing assessment. The plantation's smokehouse contains enough preserved meat to last approximately 30 days if they eat sparingly. The root cellar has vegetables adequate for another 20 days, and there's access to well water. They can survive approximately 50 days if no one steals their food supplies and if no one attacks them successfully. The first attack comes on August 24, 1831, at 11:47 a.m., approximately 31 hours after Daniel chose to stay. A group of approximately 8 men. Daniel can't determine from inside the boarded house whether they're rebels, escaped enslaved people, or white vigilantes. Approach the main house and demand entry. Daniel, positioned upstairs with a loaded rifle, shouts that the house is occupied and defended. The men respond by attempting to break down the front door using axes. Daniel fires a warning shot through a gap in the window boards, deliberately aiming high to avoid hitting anyone. The shot's crack echoes across the plantation, and the attackers retreat, either unwilling to risk assault on a defended position or concerned that gunfire will attract militia attention. Margaret, watching from a second-floor bedroom where Daniel has stationed her for safety, asks the question that reveals her own complicity in the system Daniel is defending. "Were those my slaves come back to kill me?" Daniel's answer, carefully neutral. "I don't know who they were, ma'am. Just people taking advantage of the chaos." But he knows, even if Margaret doesn't want to acknowledge it, that some of those men might indeed have been enslaved people from Whitfield Plantation, people who worked these fields for Margaret's benefit, people who might reasonably want her dead as the person who profited from their bondage. Daniel has interposed himself between Margaret and people who have legitimate grievances against her. And he's done so voluntarily, choosing her life over theirs, if it comes to that. The second attack comes on August 27, 1831, at 3:18 a.m., 4 days after Daniel's initial decision to stay. This time the attackers are definitely white vigilantes. Daniel can hear their accents and their stated purpose through the walls. They believe the plantation is occupied by rebels or fugitive enslaved people, and they intend to kill anyone inside. Daniel shouts identification. White woman and her house slave inside. Plantation owner Margaret Whitfield. The vigilantes demand proof, suspicious that this might be a rebel trick. Daniel throws Margaret's identification papers out a second-floor window, plantation ownership documents that prove her identity. The vigilantes examine the papers by torchlight, confirm their authenticity, and leave with a warning. "You better pray no rebels try to hide here, because we're shooting first and asking questions never." This encounter reveals the dangerous position Daniel has chosen. Too loyal to his mistress to be trusted by rebels or escaped enslaved people. Too black to be automatically trusted by white vigilantes who are killing black people indiscriminately. He occupies a position outside all the established categories, protected only by Margaret's identity and his willingness to defend her. Vulnerable to violence from all sides. Margaret recognizes this danger and, in one of the few recorded conversations where she acknowledges the cost of Daniel's loyalty, says to him on August 28th, "You should leave, Daniel. You'd be safer away from here. I can't protect you if those vigilantes come back." Daniel's response, "I made my choice, ma'am. I'm staying until this is over." The third, fourth, and fifth attacks come over the next 2 weeks, each time from different groups. Rebels looking for weapons and food, escaped enslaved people seeking supplies before fleeing north. White vigilantes hunting for black people to kill in revenge for the rebellion's white casualties. Daniel defends against all of them using combination of firearms, fortifications, and verbal negotiation when possible. He fires his rifles twice more in warning, never aiming to kill, but making clear that the house is defended and that assault will be costly. The attacks gradually decrease after September 8th, as militia forces restore some order to the county, and as most rebels and escaped enslaved people either flee the area or are captured and killed. But the most dangerous period comes not from direct attacks, but from isolation and resource depletion. By September 15th, 3 weeks after the rebellion began, Daniel and Margaret have exhausted the smokehouse meat supplies and are rationing the remaining vegetables to 1 meal per day. Daniel makes dangerous trips to the plantation's fields at night to dig potatoes and pick whatever vegetables have survived without maintenance, risking encounter with vigilantes or militia who patrol roads looking for fugitives. On September 19th, Daniel encounters a militia patrol while returning from one such foraging trip. The patrol consists of 5 armed white men who immediately train rifles on Daniel and demand he identify himself. "I'm Daniel, house servant to Margaret Whitfield, collecting food for my mistress," he says, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. The militia leader, a man named Crawford who knows the Whitfield plantation, asks why Daniel isn't with the militia's collection of rounded-up enslaved people awaiting redistribution to their owners. Daniel explains he never left the plantation, stayed to protect his mistress. Crawford's response reflects the confusion Daniel's choice creates. You're either the most loyal slave in Virginia or the stupidest. Either way, you're not leaving this plantation. Your mistress needs you here, and we don't need more complication trying to figure out which side you're on. This encounter establishes Daniel's status for the remainder of the crisis. He's permitted to remain on the plantation protecting Margaret, but he's also confined there. Unable to leave without risking arrest or summary execution by militia who distrust any black person moving freely during the rebellion's aftermath. Daniel has chosen to stay, but his choice has become mandatory. His loyalty transformed from voluntary decision to imposed requirement. The distinction matters psychologically, even if it doesn't change his physical situation. Daniel can no longer claim to be choosing Margaret over freedom because freedom is no longer available to him, even if he wanted it. The weeks from September 20th to October 8th test Daniel and Margaret's relationship in ways that force both to confront realities they've avoided acknowledging. Living in close quarters under threat, eating inadequate food, sleeping in shifts so one person can always watch for danger. They have conversations that would never occur under normal plantation circumstances. Margaret, weakened by age and stress and inadequate nutrition, requires increasingly personal care that Daniel provides, helping her move between rooms when her strength fails, preparing and serving all their meals, even assisting with private functions that would normally be handled by female servants. This intimate caretaking creates a dynamic that crosses boundaries slavery normally maintains. Master and slave become something closer to elderly parent and adult child, with all the complicated emotions that relationship implies. On September 27th, during one of these conversations, Margaret says something that acknowledges what both know but rarely speak aloud. I know you could have left when the others did. I know you chose to stay. I don't understand why you made that choice, Daniel. I've enslaved you your entire life. You owe me nothing but resentment. Daniel's response, as he later recounted to investigators, reveals the psychological complexity of relationships formed within slavery. You taught me to read when it was illegal. You spoke to me like I was human when most owners treat their slaves like animals. You weren't perfect, ma'am, and owning me was wrong. But you were the closest thing to family I ever had after my parents died. I couldn't let you die when I could prevent it. This exchange illustrates the impossible position slavery created. Genuine affection existing alongside fundamental injustice. Human connection coexisting with systemic oppression. Modern analysis of slavery often treats these as contradictions that must be resolved. Either relationships between enslaved people and owners were always pure exploitation, or they were sometimes genuine, which somehow redeemed slavery. But Daniel and Margaret's relationship rejects this false binary. Their affection was real. Margaret's enslavement of Daniel was wrong. Both facts coexist without resolving into tidy moral categories. The rebellion's official end comes on October 30th, 1831, when Nat Turner himself is captured after evading authorities for more than 2 months following the Uprising suppression. But for Daniel and Margaret, their isolation ends on October 8th, when Margaret's nephew Robert arrives from Richmond with militia escort to check on his aunt. Robert, 41 years old and owner of his own plantation in Virginia's Piedmont region, finds Margaret and Daniel both alive but severely weakened. Margaret has lost approximately 30 pounds and shows signs of malnutrition-related illness. Daniel has infected wounds on both hands from fortification work and a fever that suggests infection is spreading. Robert's first question to Daniel reveals assumptions about enslaved people's motivations. Did you stay because she promised you freedom? Daniel's answer: No, sir. I stayed because she needed protection and I could provide it. Robert's response captures the cognitive dissonance Daniel's choice creates for white Virginians, whose worldview depends on believing enslaved people naturally desire rebellion. You're either the best Christian I've ever met, or you're simple-minded. I can't decide which. But Robert makes a decision that will shape both Daniel and Margaret's futures. He arranges for Margaret to move to Richmond, where she can receive proper medical care, and where she'll be safer than on an isolated plantation in a county that will take years to recover from the rebellion's trauma. And he decides that Daniel will accompany Margaret as her personal servant, a position that keeps Daniel enslaved, but in circumstances more comfortable than field labor on a Virginia plantation. This decision, made by Robert rather than Daniel or Margaret, reflects slavery's fundamental reality. Daniel's loyalty earned him Margaret's gratitude, but not his freedom. Protection, but not power over his own fate. The photograph taken in October 1831 by Samuel Massary captures a moment during this transition period, after Robert's arrival but before their departure to Richmond. Daniel stands on the plantation porch. Margaret sits in her rocking chair, and between them exists a bond formed through 47 days of shared danger that defies easy categorization. They are legally master and slave, practically dependent on each other for survival, emotionally connected through years of daily interaction and recent trauma, and about to enter a new phase of their relationship in Richmond, where the crisis circumstances that tested their bond will no longer exist. If you examine the photograph carefully, looking at their faces and body language, you can see exhaustion, relief, and something more complex. The awareness that their relationship exists outside normal social categories. That Daniel's choice to stay challenges both pro-slavery and abolitionist narratives about what enslaved people want and how they relate to their owners. Daniel is not the happy slave of pro-slavery mythology, content with his bondage. But he's also not the revolutionary rebel of abolitionist imagery, using every opportunity to strike against his oppressors. He's something more complicated. A person who made an individual choice based on specific relationships and circumstances. A choice that cost him the freedom he could have claimed during the rebellion, and that can't be easily celebrated or condemned because it resists simple moral judgment. What happens next in Richmond, how Daniel and Margaret's relationship evolves in the years following the rebellion, whether Daniel ever achieves freedom, whether his loyalty is rewarded or exploited. These questions hang unresolved as the photograph freezes them in this moment of transition, preserving forever the image of two people whose relationship challenges every assumption about slavery, loyalty, and the bonds that can exist even within systems designed to prevent human connection across racial lines. The journey from Southampton County to Richmond begins on October 12, 1831, 4 days after Robert's arrival and Margaret's decision to relocate permanently to the city. The journey covers approximately 78 miles and requires 3 days of travel by horse-drawn wagon. Margaret lying on a mattress in the wagon bed due to her weakened condition. Daniel sitting beside her, monitoring her health, while Robert and a hired driver navigate the rutted roads that connect rural Virginia to its capital. The wagon passes through landscape, still showing evidence of the rebellion's aftermath. Abandoned plantations where enslaved populations fled and never returned. Burned buildings that no one has yet repaired. Freshly dug graves marking where militia killed rebel participants or suspected sympathizers. Daniel watches this devastation pass and understands that the world he knew for 19 years has fundamentally changed. That Southampton County will never return to its pre-rebellion configuration. And that he is one of the few enslaved people who experienced the rebellion without gaining freedom from it. Margaret's condition worsens during the journey, her fever spiking on the second day, to the point where she becomes delirious, calling out for her dead husband Thomas and confusing Daniel for her son, who moved to Alabama in 1814. Daniel cares for her using techniques he learned watching house servants tend to sick plantation owners. Cold compresses on her forehead to reduce fever, small amounts of water offered frequently to prevent dehydration, constant monitoring of her breathing and pulse. On the evening of October 14th, camped beside the road between Petersburg and Richmond, Margaret's fever breaks and she regains lucidity. Her first words upon waking: "Daniel, you're still here. I thought perhaps I'd dreamed it, that you'd stayed with me through everything." Daniel's response: "I'm here, ma'am. I'll be here as long as you need me." This exchange, witnessed by Robert and recorded in his journal now held at the Virginia Historical Society, reveals Robert's growing confusion about Daniel's motivations and the appropriate response to Daniel's loyalty. Robert writes, "My aunt's slave Daniel has demonstrated fidelity beyond what I believed possible from his race. He protected her through circumstances where every incentive favored abandoning her or worse. I cannot reconcile this behavior with my understanding of Negro character as naturally inclined toward indolence and rebellion. Either Daniel is exceptional among his people, or my understanding of his people is flawed. I prefer to believe the former rather than question the latter." They arrive in Richmond on October 15th, 1831, at approximately 2:30 p.m., entering a city transformed by the rebellion's psychological impact, even though the physical violence occurred 80 miles away. Richmond in October 1831 is a city of approximately 16,000 people, including 7,000 enslaved people, and the rebellion has created panic among the white population about potential urban slave uprising. The city has imposed curfews on black people, increased slave patrols, banned gatherings of more than 3 enslaved people without white supervision, and created an atmosphere of suspicion where every black person is viewed as potential rebel. Daniel, arriving in this environment as the enslaved man who stayed loyal during the rebellion, becomes an immediate object of fascination and confusion for Richmond's white population who cannot reconcile his behavior with their fears about slave rebellion. Robert has arranged housing for Margaret in a 3-story townhouse at 47 Grace Street in Richmond's Church Hill neighborhood, a comfortable residence appropriate for elderly widow of means. The house includes servants' quarters in the basement where Daniel will live, a main floor with parlor and dining room where Margaret will receive visitors and conduct daily activities, and second and third floors with bedrooms and private chambers. Margaret's health requires constant attention for the first 3 weeks in Richmond. The malnutrition and stress from 47 days of isolation have weakened her significantly, and she develops respiratory infection that requires doctor's care. Daniel provides this care under supervision of Dr. James Ferguson, a physician who visits daily from October 16th through November 7 to monitor Margaret's recovery. Dr. Ferguson's medical notes, preserved in the Virginia Medical College archives, document both Margaret's physical recovery and Ferguson's observations about Daniel. Patient is 73-year-old white female recovering from extended period of inadequate nutrition and psychological stress. Care is provided primarily by her slave Daniel, a Negro boy of approximately 19 years who demonstrates unusual competence in medical tasks. Patient insists on Daniel's presence during examinations and becomes agitated when he leaves the room. The bond between patient and slave is remarkable and possibly unhealthy. Patient treats slave more as son than servant, creating confusion about proper racial boundaries. Have recommended patient acquire female servant for personal care, but patient refuses, stating she trusts only Daniel. This recommendation to replace Daniel with a female servant reflects societal discomfort with the intimacy required for elderly woman's care being provided by a young man, even an enslaved one. But Margaret's refusal to accept alternative caregivers reveals the depth of her dependence on Daniel, a dependence that goes beyond physical care to emotional reliance on the person who stayed with her through the rebellion when everyone else fled. This dependence creates a power dynamic unusual in master-slave relationships. While Margaret legally owns Daniel and can sell him at will, she emotionally needs him in ways that give him influence over her decisions despite his enslaved status. Daniel's position in Richmond society becomes increasingly complicated during November and December 1831 as word spreads about his loyalty during the rebellion. He is simultaneously celebrated by white Virginians who want to believe enslaved people can be content and loyal, and distrusted by other enslaved people in Richmond who view his choice to stay as betrayal of racial solidarity. On November 23, 1831, Daniel is invited to speak at First Presbyterian Church's Wednesday evening service about his experiences during the rebellion. An extraordinary honor for an enslaved person in a society that normally forbids enslaved people from speaking publicly. The invitation comes from Reverend John Holt Rice, a prominent minister who sees Daniel's story as evidence supporting slavery's defenders' argument that enslaved people are happy under kind masters. Daniel's speech, delivered on November 23, 1831, to an audience of approximately 200 white Richmond residents, carefully navigates between truth and what his audience wants to hear. He describes the rebellion's violence, the chaos of 47 days in isolation, the physical hardship of protecting Margaret, and his decision to stay rather than flee. But he frames this decision in language that emphasizes personal loyalty rather than love, duty rather than affection, avoiding any suggestion that his relationship with Margaret transcends the master-slave boundary in ways that might make white audience uncomfortable. The speech's most powerful moment, as recorded in newspaper accounts, comes when Daniel says, "I stayed because abandoning an elderly woman to probable death was wrong, regardless of her race or my status as her property. Morality doesn't change based on legal condition. Right action is right action, whether performed by free person or slave." This statement walks a careful line. It affirms Christian morality that white audience values while implicitly asserting Daniel's moral agency independent of his enslaved status. The audience responds with sustained applause, viewing Daniel's speech as confirmation that slavery can be humane when practiced correctly. But Daniel's actual message is more subversive. By claiming moral authority to judge right and wrong independent of his master's commands, he asserts human agency that slavery's fundamental logic denies. If enslaved people can make moral decisions independent of their owner's will, then they are moral beings equal to free people, which undermines slavery's philosophical justification as a system where superior people govern inferior ones for inferior ones' benefit. The response from Richmond's enslaved community to Daniel's speech is negative and swift. On November 25, 1831, 2 days after the church speech, Daniel is confronted while shopping for household supplies by 3 enslaved men who work on nearby properties. The confrontation, as Daniel later recounted to Margaret and as Margaret documented in a letter to Robert, includes accusations that Daniel is traitor to his race, that his loyalty to Margaret betrayed every slave who died fighting for freedom, and that he chose master's approval over people's liberation. Daniel's response, according to his account: "I made a choice based on specific circumstances and specific relationships. I don't claim my choice was right for everyone. I claim it was right for me, given who Margaret Whitfield is and who I am. Judge me if you want, but don't pretend you know what you would have done if you'd been in my situation." This confrontation reveals the impossible position Daniel occupies. Too loyal to be accepted by enslaved people seeking resistance and liberation. Too clearly human and morally complex to fit slavery's dehumanizing categories. He exists in a social limbo, praised by white people who misunderstand his motivations and rejected by black people who view his choice as collaboration with oppression. The only person who seems to understand Daniel's position without judgment is Margaret herself, who increasingly treats him less as property and more as family despite the legal impossibility of such recognition. The question of Daniel's legal status and potential manumission becomes subject of discussion between Margaret and Robert during Robert's visit to Richmond in December 1831. Robert, having observed Daniel's loyalty and Margaret's dependence on him, suggests that Margaret should free Daniel as reward for his service during the rebellion. The conversation, as Margaret later recounted in correspondence, reveals the complicated economics and social pressures surrounding manumission in post-rebellion Virginia. Robert: Aunt Margaret, you should free Daniel. He earned his freedom by protecting you when he could have fled or killed you. Virginia law permits manumission for meritorious service, and I can't imagine service more meritorious than saving your life. Margaret: I've considered it, but Daniel's freedom creates problems. If I free him, he must leave Virginia within 1 year under the 1806 law requiring freed slaves to leave the state. Where would he go? He has no family, no connections outside Virginia, no resources to establish himself in a free state. Freeing him might condemn him to poverty and isolation worse than his current situation. Robert: Then free him, but allow him to stay as paid employee. Technically, he'd be free. Practically, he'd remain in your household, but with legal rights and wages. Margaret: And what would Richmond society say about an elderly white woman living alone with a young black man, even a freed one? The scandal would destroy both our reputations. Daniel would be harassed, possibly killed by whites who object to free blacks, and I would be ostracized for improper behavior. The current arrangement protects us both, however imperfect it is. This conversation, documented in Margaret's December 28, 1831 letter to her daughter in Alabama, reveals the systemic barriers preventing manumission even when slave owner wants to grant freedom and enslaved person has earned it. Virginia's 1806 law requiring freed enslaved people to leave the state within 12 months was designed specifically to prevent growth of free black population that white Virginians feared would inspire slave rebellion. The law meant that manumission often severed freed people from families, communities, and economic opportunities, making freedom less appealing than it should have been. Margaret's argument that freeing Daniel would harm him rather than help him reflects both genuine concern for his welfare and self-interested rationalization for maintaining profitable property relationship. But Margaret makes a different decision that acknowledges Daniel's exceptional status without legally freeing him. She begins paying him wages starting January 1st, 1832, at rate of $5 per month. Money that Daniel can save or spend as he chooses. She also grants him unprecedented autonomy. He can leave the house without permission. He can socialize with other enslaved people during free time. He can refuse work assignments he considers unreasonable. And he has access to Margaret's library to continue the education she started when he was young. These privileges make Daniel's slavery more comfortable, but don't change his fundamental status as property. Creating a hybrid condition between slavery and freedom that satisfies no one's ideological preferences, but reflects the messy reality of human relationships within oppressive systems. Daniel's life in Richmond from 1832 through 1840 settles into a pattern that defies easy categorization. He continues serving as Margaret's primary caregiver as she ages from 73 to 81, providing increasingly intimate physical care as her health declines. He manages the household finances, purchases supplies, coordinates with physicians, and essentially functions as head of household despite his enslaved status. He earns $5 per month wages that accumulate to $60 per year. Money that Margaret deposits in a Richmond bank account in Daniel's name, despite Virginia law technically prohibiting enslaved people from owning property. By 1840, Daniel has accumulated $480 in savings, a substantial sum that represents 8 years of wages plus modest interest. But Daniel's unusual position creates ongoing tension with both white and black communities in Richmond. White residents view him with mixture of approval for his loyalty and suspicion about his privileges, questioning whether Margaret is maintaining proper racial boundaries. Black residents, both enslaved and the small population of free blacks who remained in Virginia despite the 1806 law's restrictions, view him with varying degrees of contempt, pity, and confusion. Some see him as race traitor, who chose individual comfort over collective liberation. Others see him as victim of psychological manipulation, who doesn't understand his own oppression. A few see him as pragmatist, making best of impossible situation, though this sympathetic view is minority position. Daniel's own perspective on his choices and situation is documented in a remarkable source. A diary he kept from 1832 to 1847, written in secrecy despite literacy being illegal for enslaved people, hidden in a locked box in his basement quarters, and discovered after his death by Margaret's relatives, who donated it to the Virginia Historical Society in 1889. The diary contains 847 entries, ranging from brief daily notes to extended reflections on his relationship with Margaret, his thoughts on slavery and freedom, and his internal conflicts about the choices he's made. The diary reveals Daniel to be far more intellectually sophisticated and morally conflicted than either his white admirers or black critics imagined. A representative entry from March 15, 1835. Daniel's 23rd birthday. Today, I am 23 years old and have been enslaved for all but the first 7 years of my life, when I was technically free, but actually orphaned and helpless. White people who praise my loyalty to Mrs. Whitfield believe I am happy in my bondage, content with my lot, evidence that slavery can be benevolent. Black people who condemn my loyalty believe I am psychologically damaged, unable to recognize my own oppression, a cautionary tale about slaves who identify with masters. Both sides are wrong. I am neither happy nor damaged. I am a person making impossible choices in an impossible situation. I love Mrs. Whitfield genuinely, while hating the system that made her my owner. I value my relative privileges while recognizing they don't constitute freedom. I live in contradictions that I cannot resolve because the system itself is contradictory. I stayed during the rebellion, not because I am happy slave, but because abandoning an elderly woman to probable death was morally wrong regardless of my legal status. The fact that white people interpret my choice as proof slavery is good, and black people interpret it as proof I am broken, says more about their need for simple narratives than about my actual motivations. This diary entry, and hundreds like it, reveals Daniel's sophisticated understanding of his own position and his rejection of both pro-slavery and abolitionist attempts to simplify his story into propaganda for their respective causes. Daniel understands that he is simultaneously victim of slavery and agent making real choices within constraints slavery imposes. He recognizes that his love for Margaret coexists with his understanding that her ownership of him is fundamentally wrong. He accepts that his privileges are real advantages while insisting they don't constitute freedom. This intellectual sophistication challenges assumptions on all sides. Pro-slavery advocates who believe enslaved people lack capacity for complex moral reasoning, and abolitionists who believe enslaved people should always choose rebellion over accommodation. Margaret's health begins seriously declining in 1839. When she suffers a stroke at age 81 that paralyzes her right side and leaves her bedridden for the final 2 years of her life. Daniel's role during this period becomes more nurse than servant, providing round-the-clock care that includes feeding, bathing, moving Margaret to prevent bed sores, and managing her pain using laudanum and other medications prescribed by Dr. Ferguson. The intimacy of this care crosses every boundary Victorian society maintained between young men and elderly women. between enslaved people and owners, between appropriate and inappropriate relationships. But necessity overrides propriety. Margaret needs care that only Daniel can provide because she trusts no one else, and because Daniel has years of experience learning her preferences and needs. On April 3, 1841, at 3:17 a.m., Margaret dies in her sleep with Daniel sitting vigil beside her bed. She is 83 years old, has lived in Richmond for 9.5 years following the rebellion, and has been bedridden for the final 2 years. Daniel, now 29 years old, has spent more than half his life in Margaret's service, has saved her life during the rebellion, has cared for her through final illness, and now faces uncertain future because his unique position in Richmond depended on Margaret's protection and his role as her caretaker. With Margaret dead, Daniel becomes simply another enslaved person, subject to disposition according to her will and Virginia law. Margaret's will, read publicly on April 8, 1841, contains provisions that shock Richmond society and create legal controversy lasting 3 years. The relevant sections: I hereby manumit my slave Daniel, granting him complete freedom from bondage in recognition of his faithful service over 22 years and his exceptional loyalty during the 1831 rebellion. I bequeath to Daniel the sum of $200 from my estate, this amount representing partial compensation for services rendered beyond normal requirements of enslaved labor. I direct my nephew Robert Whitfield to assist Daniel in relocating to a free state where he may live as free man, without Virginia's restrictions on freed people. These provisions seem generous and appropriate given Daniel's service, but they create 3 major problems. First, Virginia law requires freed enslaved people to leave the state within 12 months of manumission, giving Daniel 1 year to establish himself in unfamiliar free state with no family connections or social support network. Second, the $200 bequest is challenged by Margaret's distant relatives who claim the money should go to family rather than to former slave, requiring 3 years of legal proceedings before Daniel receives any funds. Third, the will's language about services rendered beyond normal requirements implicitly acknowledges that Daniel provided more than slavery legally required, raising questions about whether enslaved people can ever truly serve voluntarily or whether all enslaved labor is coerced regardless of relationship quality. The legal battle over Daniel's inheritance reveals white Virginia society's discomfort with rewarding enslaved loyalty too generously. Margaret's second cousin William Whitfield files lawsuit in May 1841, contesting the $200 bequest, arguing, to grant large sum to former slave sets, dangerous precedent, suggesting slaves can earn their way to freedom through exceptional service. This undermines slavery's necessary fiction that enslavement is permanent condition unrelated to individual behavior or merit. If slaves believe they can earn freedom through good service, they will expect rewards for normal obedience, making slavery unworkable. The lawsuit frames the issue not as whether Daniel deserves the money. Even William concedes Daniel provided extraordinary service, but whether allowing such bequests threatens slavery's social structure by suggesting enslaved people's behavior matters and can be rewarded with freedom. Daniel, free as of Margaret's death, but trapped in legal limbo regarding his inheritance, spends 1841-1844 in Richmond working various jobs while the inheritance lawsuit proceeds through Virginia courts. He works as paid laborer for Robert Whitfield's household, as porter at Richmond boarding house, as skilled carpenter using techniques learned during plantation maintenance work. His legal status as freed person, but not yet truly free. He can be arrested and enslaved for any minor legal violation. He faces constant harassment from whites uncomfortable with free blacks. And he lacks resources to relocate to free state where he would have greater security. Creates daily anxiety about his future. The diary entries from this period reveal a man increasingly bitter about the outcome of his loyalty, questioning whether protecting Margaret during the rebellion was worth the cost. Diary entry, August 17th, 1842. I am 30 years old, legally free, practically trapped. I saved Mrs. Whitfield's life during rebellion when I could have fled to freedom. I cared for her for 22 years, providing service beyond what slavery required. My reward? Manumission that requires me to leave Virginia, inheritance tied up in legal proceedings for years, and daily life of harassment from whites who resent free blacks and blacks who resent my former loyalty. If I had fled in 1831, I would have been free 11 years earlier. If I had joined the rebellion, I would likely be dead. But at least I would have died fighting rather than waiting for legal system to decide whether I deserve what was promised me. I made the moral choice during the rebellion, but the moral choice has cost me everything. The lawsuit resolves in Daniel's favor on February 12, 1844, when Virginia Supreme Court rules that Margaret's bequest to Daniel is legally valid under Virginia law governing wills and manumission. Daniel receives $2,200 plus 3 years of accumulated interest totaling approximately $180, giving him $1,380 to start his new life. Combined with his savings of $480 from wages Margaret paid him, Daniel has $1,860 total, a substantial sum equal to approximately 3 years' wages for skilled white laborer. With these funds, Daniel makes the decision that Margaret's will required and that Virginia law mandates. He leaves Virginia for Ohio, a free state where he can live without constant legal vulnerability and social harassment. Daniel departs Richmond on March 3, 1844, taking a steamboat up the James River to Chesapeake Bay, then coastal packet to Baltimore, then overland to Wheeling, Virginia, soon to become West Virginia, and finally steamboat down the Ohio River to Cincinnati. The journey covers approximately 650 miles over 11 days, costs Daniel approximately $45 for transportation and lodging, and takes him farther from Virginia than he has ever been in his 32 years of life. He arrives in Cincinnati on March 14, 1844, knowing no one, having no family or community connections, but possessing education unusual for formerly enslaved person and financial resources that give him options most freed people lack. Cincinnati in 1844 is a city of approximately 46,000 people, including roughly 2,300 black residents, both freeborn and formerly enslaved people who escaped or were manumitted. The city has established black community with churches, mutual aid societies, and businesses that provide support network for newly arrived freed people. Daniel finds lodging at a boarding house operated by a black woman named Sarah Parker, formerly enslaved in Maryland, freed in 1837, who operates her boarding house as both business and community service, helping freed people establish themselves in Cincinnati. Sarah charges Daniel $3 per month for room and board, connects him with black church community, and introduces him to skilled tradesmen looking for workers. Daniel's literacy and education make him valuable employee in ways unusual for freed enslaved people, most of whom lack formal education due to laws prohibiting slave literacy. He finds work as bookkeeper for a black-owned furniture manufacturing business, earning $25 per month, substantially more than most freed people earn in their first years of freedom. His savings, combined with steady income, allow him to establish comfortable life in Cincinnati over the next 3 years. He purchases small house in 1846 for $420. He joins African Methodist Episcopal Church, where he teaches literacy to freed people and escaped fugitive slaves passing through Cincinnati on Underground Railroad. And he becomes respected member of Cincinnati's free black community. But Daniel's past loyalty to Margaret Whitfield follows him to Cincinnati in ways that create ongoing tensions within black community. In September 1845, Daniel is invited to speak at anti-slavery meeting organized by Cincinnati's Black Methodist Church about his experiences during Nat Turner's rebellion. He accepts the invitation, expecting to share his perspective on the rebellion's complexity and his own difficult choices. But the audience, consisting primarily of formerly enslaved people and abolitionists, responds negatively to Daniel's nuanced account that acknowledges genuine affection for Margaret while condemning slavery as system. Audience members interrupt Daniel's speech with shouts of "House Negro," "Uncle Tom," and "slavery apologist." The meeting devolves into confrontation, with Daniel defending his choices and critics accusing him of betraying the cause of black liberation by his loyalty to white slave owner. This confrontation reveals the political pressures freed people faced in antebellum North. Anti-slavery movement wanted simple narratives of slavery's complete evil and enslaved people's complete resistance, not complicated stories about genuine relationships and difficult moral choices. Daniel's story threatens this narrative because it suggests that some enslaved people had real reasons for loyalty beyond fear or ignorance, that some master-slave relationships included genuine affection, and that not all enslaved people prioritized resistance above all other considerations. These acknowledgments don't defend slavery. Daniel consistently condemns slavery as a moral system, but they complicate the simple moral clarity that anti-slavery propaganda required. Daniel stops accepting speaking invitations after the September 1845 confrontation, choosing instead to live quietly in Cincinnati, working, teaching literacy, and avoiding public discussion of his past. His diary entries from this period reveal a man increasingly isolated by his unique experiences, unable to find community among people who understand his specific history and choices. He never marries, never has children, maintains few close friendships beyond his landlady Sarah Parker and a small circle of church members. His life is comfortable materially, but lonely psychologically. The cost of being a person whose experiences don't fit into anyone's preferred narrative about slavery and freedom. Daniel's final diary entry, written on November 8, 1847, reflects on 16 years since his decision to stay with Margaret during the rebellion. "I am 35 years old, free for 6 years, and still paying the price for choosing loyalty over liberation in 1831. White people who know my history think I proved slaves can be happy if masters are kind. Black people who know my history think I proved slavery damages minds as well as bodies. Both interpretations reduce my complex choice to simple propaganda for their respective causes. The truth is messier. I loved a woman who owned me. I made a moral choice to protect her despite the cost to myself, and I live with the consequences of that choice every day. Freedom has not erased the psychological complexity of those 47 days or the 22 years of service that preceded them. I am free in law, but still bound by memory to relationship that defined my youth and shaped my character. I do not regret my choice, but I recognize its costs. Margaret is dead, I am alive and free, and the world has moved on from the rebellion that gave me my defining moment. But I remain frozen in that moment, the slave who chose loyalty, unable to move forward or backward, trapped between two worlds that both reject me." Daniel dies on January 15, 1848, at age 35, from pneumonia contracted during the harsh Cincinnati winter. He is buried in a black cemetery in Cincinnati's West End neighborhood, his gravestone reading simply, "Daniel Freeman, born enslaved 1812, died free 1848. The surname Freeman that appears on his gravestone is one he chose after Margaret's death, replacing Daniel Whitfield, that marked him as Margaret's property. The name choice reveals his attempt to define himself by freedom rather than by his relationship to former owner. though the gravestone's emphasis on born enslaved, died free, suggests that slavery remained the central fact of his identity even in death. Daniel's diary, discovered among his possessions after his death and donated to the Ohio Historical Society by Sarah Parker, was published in heavily edited form in 1889 as The Faithful Slave, Diary of a Negro Man's Loyalty during the Southampton Insurrection. The published version omitted entries where Daniel criticized slavery harshly or expressed doubt about his choices, creating sanitized version that portrayed Daniel as happy slave content with his lot. The complete, unedited diary wasn't published until 1957, when historians finally presented Daniel's full complexity, his genuine love for Margaret coexisting with his condemnation of slavery, his pride in his loyalty coexisting with his bitterness about its costs, his sophisticated understanding of his own impossible position. The 1957 publication, titled Between Two Worlds, The Diary of Daniel Freeman, Formerly Enslaved, presented Daniel as he actually was rather than as propaganda for either pro-slavery or anti-slavery causes. Modern historical assessment of Daniel's story struggles with the same questions that tormented Daniel himself. Was his loyalty to Margaret praiseworthy moral choice or psychologically damaged response to trauma of enslavement? Did his decision to protect her during the rebellion represent genuine moral agency or internalized oppression that prevented him from recognizing his own interests? Should his story be celebrated as example of individual making difficult moral choice based on specific relationships, or condemned as example of how slavery could make enslaved people complicit in their own oppression? These questions resist simple answers because Daniel himself resists simple categorization. He was not the happy slave of pro-slavery mythology, content with his bondage and grateful to kind master. But he was also not the revolutionary hero of abolitionist imagery, using every opportunity to resist and rebel. He was something more complicated. A person who loved someone he should have hated according to simple political logic, who made a choice that cost him freedom he could have claimed, who lived with the consequences of that choice for 16 years after making it, and who died still trying to understand whether his loyalty was virtue or vice, strength or weakness, moral triumph or tragic mistake. The photograph taken in October 1831 by Samuel Massery, showing Daniel standing protectively near Margaret on the plantation porch, captures them at the moment when Daniel's choice had just been made, but its consequences were not yet fully apparent. In that image, they are legally master and slave, practically protector and protected, emotionally connected by shared trauma and years of daily interaction. The photograph became one of the most controversial images of the antebellum period. Pro-slavery advocates used it as evidence that slavery could be humane. Abolitionists condemned it as example of slavery's psychological damage. And modern viewers see it as testament to the messy complexity of human relationships that exist even within dehumanizing systems. If you examine the photograph carefully, looking at Daniel's face and posture, you can see exhaustion from 47 days of crisis, relief that both he and Margaret survived, and something more complex. The awareness that his choice to stay has bound him to Margaret in ways that will shape his entire future, that his loyalty has earned him neither freedom nor understanding from either white or black communities, and that he occupies a position outside all normal social categories, too loyal to be revolutionary, too clearly intelligent and morally complex to fit slavery's dehumanizing logic, trapped in the space between complete oppression and genuine freedom. Where most enslaved people actually lived, but where neither pro-slavery nor anti-slavery narratives wanted to acknowledge people could exist. Margaret Whitfield's legacy is complicated by her relationship with Daniel. She was slave owner who perpetuated immoral system, but she was also person who treated Daniel with genuine kindness and whose relationship with him challenged slavery's logic. She died believing she had rewarded Daniel appropriately by freeing him and bequeathing him substantial inheritance, not understanding that freedom and money couldn't undo the psychological complexity of 22 years of enslavement or the social isolation his unique history would create. Her will's language about Daniel providing services rendered beyond normal requirements of enslaved labor inadvertently acknowledged what slavery's defenders denied: that enslaved people could act voluntarily, could make moral choices, could provide service beyond what coercion compelled, which meant they were moral agents rather than property, which undermined slavery's entire philosophical justification. Daniel Freeman's legacy is even more complicated. He is simultaneously an example of human capacity for moral choice under impossible circumstances, and cautionary tale about costs of loyalty to individuals within systems that oppress entire populations. His story resists use as propaganda for any political position because it insists on complexity where politics demands simplicity. Pro-slavery advocates who tried to use Daniel's story as evidence of slavery's benevolence had to ignore Daniel's own writings condemning slavery as fundamentally immoral. Anti-slavery advocates who wanted to use Daniel's story as example of slavery's psychological damage had to ignore Daniel's sophisticated understanding of his own choices and motivations. Modern historians who want to celebrate Daniel's moral courage must acknowledge that his loyalty cost him freedom and isolated him from black community that could have supported him. And those who want to condemn his loyalty must acknowledge that abandoning elderly woman to probable death during chaos of rebellion was genuinely morally difficult choice that reasonable people could answer differently. The final accounting of Daniel's 47 days protecting Margaret during Nat Turner's rebellion. He saved her life during a moment when 2,300 other enslaved people claimed their freedom. He defended against 8 attacks over 47 days using firearms and fortifications. He survived on inadequate food and constant stress for nearly 7 weeks. He earned gratitude but not immediate freedom. He gained complex legacy that neither white nor black communities could fully understand or accept. And he died at 35, having spent 6 years of legal freedom, still psychologically bound to the 22 years of slavery that shaped him. His choice to stay was both admirable moral decision and tragic accommodation to unjust system, both expression of genuine love and evidence of slavery's power to complicate every human relationship. Both individual act of conscience and historical event that reveals how slavery forced people into choices where every option carried unbearable costs. Daniel Freeman stood on a porch in October 1831 beside a woman he loved despite knowing he shouldn't. A woman who owned him despite treating him with uncommon kindness. A woman whose life he saved at the cost of the freedom he could have claimed. That image, frozen in Samuel Massery's photograph, preserves a moment that defies every simple story we tell about slavery, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that human relationships can be genuine and meaningful, even within systems designed to destroy humanity, and that acknowledging this truth doesn't redeem slavery, but rather reveals its even deeper evil. Not just that it oppressed people, but that it corrupted every relationship, every choice, every expression of love or loyalty, turning moral clarity into moral complexity and making it impossible to be both good and free.